millions of Americans once cleaned themselves with corn cobs. Not paper, not tissues, not wet wipes, corn cobs. And strange as that sounds, they were actually one of the better options. For most of human history, toilet paper did not exist. Not in ancient Rome, not in medieval Europe, not during the Renaissance, not even in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Every human being who ever lived faced exactly the same problem. What do you do after using the toilet? The answers were often uncomfortable, sometimes painful, and occasionally dangerous. Yet for thousands of years, people simply accepted these solutions because they had no alternative. The modern roll of toilet paper sitting in your bathroom today is one of those inventions so ordinary that nobody thinks about it. But if you remove it from history, the world becomes a very different place. To understand how strange things once were, we need to travel back thousands of years. Long before supermarkets, long before plumbing, long before bathrooms even existed. Because for most of human history, people did not go to the bathroom in private. The idea of a private bathroom is surprisingly modern. Ancient cities had public latrines where dozens of people sat side by side doing their business while carrying on conversations. Imagine walking into a room today and finding 20 strangers sitting together in a public restroom discussing politics. That would seem absurd. To the Romans, it was perfectly normal. Ancient Rome possessed some of the most sophisticated sanitation systems in the ancient world. Their aqueducts carried water across enormous distances. Their sewer systems were engineering marvels. Yet even they had no toilet paper. Instead, Romans used something called a tersorium. A tersorium was essentially a sponge attached to a wooden stick. After using the toilet, a person would clean themselves using the sponge and then place it back into a container filled with vinegar or salt water. Then the next person used the same sponge. And then the next. And then the next. The sponge was communal, shared by everyone. The modern human mind immediately recoils from this idea. But remember, toilet paper had not been invented. People used whatever solution was available. The Romans genuinely believed they had developed an efficient sanitation system. Compared to many alternatives available at the time, they were not entirely wrong. Elsewhere in the ancient world, people improvised. Ancient Greeks sometimes used small stones or pieces of broken pottery. Archaeologists have discovered rounded ceramic fragments near ancient latrines that appear to have served this purpose. Needless to say, these methods were not particularly comfortable. In some cases, historians believe excessive use could cause injuries and infections. Nature itself became humanity's bathroom supply store. Leaves, grass, moss, animal fur, seashells, wood shavings. People used whatever existed nearby. The solution depended entirely on geography. If you lived near forests, leaves were common. If you lived near the coast, shells might be available. If you lived in colder regions, moss and wool were often preferred because they were softer. The quality of your bathroom experience depended largely on where you happened to be born. And sometimes on how wealthy you were. As civilizations became more complex, social class began influencing hygiene. The rich could afford cloth. The poor often relied on whatever nature provided. This pattern repeated itself across centuries. Throughout Europe, wealthy households sometimes kept reusable pieces of fabric specifically for personal hygiene. Servants washed them regularly. For poorer families, such luxuries were impossible. They used straw, hay, rags, anything available. And yet, for thousands of years, nobody considered this unusual. Because nobody knew a better alternative existed. The real turning point occurred in China. Centuries before Europeans would discover toilet paper, the Chinese were already experimenting with paper itself. Paper had been invented in China during the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE. Its impact on history would eventually be enormous. Books, government records, maps, education, all became easier because of paper. But someone eventually noticed another use. It was soft, disposable, and far more comfortable than stones. Historical records suggest that by the 6th century CE, some Chinese aristocrats were already using paper for personal hygiene. By the 14th century, toilet paper production in China had become surprisingly large-scale. One historical source records that the imperial court ordered millions of sheets annually. Millions. While much of Europe was still relying on straw and cloth, China's elite had already discovered something remarkably similar to modern toilet paper. Yet this innovation remained largely confined to East Asia. The idea would take centuries to spread elsewhere. Meanwhile, Europe continued improvising. And sometimes those improvisations became very strange indeed. One of the strangest examples emerged much later in North America. The humble corn cob. By the 19th century, corn was everywhere in rural America. After harvesting the edible kernels, farmers were left with the central cob. Dry, rough, abundant, and free. Millions of Americans used them. Today it sounds almost unbelievable. Yet historical accounts repeatedly mention corn cobs as a common solution across farming communities. The reason was simple. Toilet paper was expensive. Many families could not justify spending money on something they intended to throw away. The corn cob was already there, waiting, free of charge. It was not comfortable, but neither was most of rural life. And for generations, people accepted it. The truth is that before toilet paper, bathroom hygiene was less about comfort and more about practicality. People adapted to whatever resources surrounded them. Some methods were better than others. Many were worse than you imagine. And the story becomes even stranger when industrialization arrives. Because the invention that eventually transformed bathroom hygiene forever was not originally created for that purpose at all. And when the first commercial toilet paper finally appeared, most people refused to buy it. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was changing rapidly. Railroads stretched across the country. Factories multiplied. Cities grew larger every year. Technology was transforming daily life. But when it came to bathroom hygiene, most Americans were still living in a world that would feel surprisingly primitive today. Toilet paper did not yet exist as a common household product. Instead, people used whatever happened to be available. And one item became especially popular: newspapers. The average American home in the 1800s accumulated old newspapers constantly. Once they had been read, they served a second purpose. Many outhouses actually included a nail driven into the wall. Old newspapers were hung from that nail and used whenever needed. The arrangement was simple, cheap, and most importantly free. Farm families became experts at finding alternative uses for everyday items. Nothing was wasted. Every object had a second life. And newspapers were no exception. As literacy increased and printing costs fell, newspapers became one of the most common household materials in America. Entire generations grew up assuming that newspapers were simply part of the bathroom experience. But newspapers were not the only reading material being repurposed. There was another publication that became legendary for its unexpected role in American hygiene. The Sears Roebuck Catalog. For younger viewers, it is difficult to explain just how important the Sears catalog once was. Before the internet, before shopping malls, before Amazon, the Sears catalog allowed Americans to order almost anything by mail. Clothing, furniture, tools, household supplies, entire houses. The catalog was massive, sometimes hundreds of pages thick. And once it became outdated, many families found another use for it. Millions of Americans took old Sears catalogs into the outhouse. The pages were thick, plentiful, and already sitting around the house. Some historians have joked that the Sears catalog may have done as much bathroom service as commercial toilet paper during parts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The joke is not entirely inaccurate. In fact, the practice became so widespread that when Sears eventually switched to glossy paper, customers reportedly complained because the new pages were less practical for their secondary purpose. The reality was simple. People did not see a reason to purchase a dedicated product when free alternatives already existed. That became a major problem for the man who invented commercial toilet paper. His name was Joseph Gayetty, and he was about to introduce a product that many Americans considered ridiculous. In 1857, Gayetty launched what is generally recognized as the first commercially packaged toilet paper in the United States. He called it Gayetty's medicated paper. The marketing was ambitious. The packaging was elegant. Each sheet was infused with aloe. And every individual piece carried Gayetty's name printed directly onto the paper itself. Imagine seeing your own name printed on every square of toilet paper. Joseph Gayetty apparently thought this was excellent branding. The public was less enthusiastic. His invention was revolutionary. But it had one enormous problem. People were embarrassed. Very embarrassed. Modern consumers often forget how uncomfortable 19th century society was when discussing bodily functions. Even mentioning the bathroom publicly could be considered improper. Stores often avoided displaying products associated with personal hygiene. Customers avoided asking for them. The entire subject was wrapped in social discomfort. Walking into a store and requesting toilet paper was not viewed as normal. It was awkward, embarrassing, potentially humiliating. As a result, Gayetty's product struggled. Not because it was ineffective, not because people disliked it, but because many customers could not bring themselves to buy it. Newspapers were free. Toilet paper cost money. And purchasing it required discussing a topic that polite society preferred to ignore entirely. The idea was simply ahead of its time. Yet the logic behind it was undeniable. Toilet paper was cleaner, more convenient, and generally more comfortable than the alternatives. Slowly, attitudes began to change. The next major breakthrough arrived in 1890. That year, the Scott Paper Company introduced a new format: the toilet paper roll. This seems obvious today, but at the time, it was revolutionary. Instead of buying individual sheets, consumers could purchase a roll containing hundreds of them. Storage became easier. Distribution became easier. Use became easier. The roll transformed toilet paper from a novelty into a practical household product. And yet even then, adoption was slow. Many Americans remained unconvinced, partly because of habit, partly because of cost, and partly because toilet paper itself still had a major quality problem. Early toilet paper was terrible. By modern standards, it was shockingly unpleasant. The paper was rough, sometimes painfully rough. Splinters occasionally appeared because the manufacturing process was not yet refined. Yes, wood splinters in toilet paper. The advertisements of the early 20th century rarely mentioned softness because softness barely existed. Manufacturers focused instead on cleanliness and convenience. Comfort would come later. Consumers tolerated these flaws because the alternatives were not exactly luxurious. But the industry still faced another obstacle. People continued to view bathroom products as something vaguely embarrassing. Many stores would not display toilet paper openly. Customers often had to ask clerks for it directly. Imagine standing in a crowded general store and announcing that you needed toilet paper. For many Americans, that felt deeply uncomfortable. The industry needed a way to normalize the product. And that normalization would take decades. Fortunately for manufacturers, history was about to provide exactly what they needed. Because the 20th century brought two developments that would change everything. The first was indoor plumbing. The second was modern urban living. Together, they would transform toilet paper from an optional convenience into an everyday necessity. And once that transformation began, there would be no going back. The age of newspapers hanging in outhouses was coming to an end. The age of the toilet paper roll had arrived. But the most surprising chapter of the story was still ahead. Because the rise of toilet paper would eventually create an industry worth billions of dollars, trigger nationwide shortages, and reveal something fascinating about human psychology. A simple roll of paper was about to become one of the most essential products in modern civilization. By the early 20th century, toilet paper had survived its awkward beginning. People were buying it. Stores were stocking it. Manufacturers were improving it. But it was still not an essential product. That changed because of something much bigger than toilet paper itself. Indoor plumbing. For most of human history, people relieved themselves outdoors in chamber pots or in outhouses located some distance from the home. But as cities expanded and modern plumbing spread across Europe and North America, bathrooms moved indoors. Suddenly, millions of people were using flush toilets every day. And that created a new problem. Many of the old materials people had relied on for centuries simply did not work anymore. Newspapers clogged pipes. Cloth required washing. Straw hay and leaves caused plumbing disasters. Modern toilets demanded something different. They needed a material that was disposable, inexpensive, and capable of breaking down in water. Toilet paper was perfectly positioned to solve that problem. For the first time in history, a product designed specifically for bathroom hygiene became not merely convenient but necessary. The timing was perfect. As cities grew larger, Americans became increasingly concerned with cleanliness. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a growing understanding of germs and disease. Doctors were discovering how infections spread. Public health campaigns promoted hygiene. Municipal governments invested heavily in sanitation systems. Cleanliness became associated with modernity itself. Toilet paper companies understood this cultural shift immediately. Their advertisements rarely focused on comfort. Instead, they focused on health. They promised cleanliness, safety, protection. Consumers who once considered toilet paper an unnecessary luxury began viewing it as a responsible household purchase. The industry expanded rapidly. Competition intensified. And manufacturers searched desperately for ways to distinguish their products. One company would eventually become particularly successful. Charmin. Founded in the 1920s, the company recognized something important. Consumers were no longer concerned only with hygiene. They wanted comfort. The industry had spent decades selling cleanliness. Now it could start selling softness. This sounds obvious today. But at the time, it represented a major shift. Toilet paper advertisements increasingly emphasized softness, comfort, and quality. Manufacturing processes improved dramatically. The rough, splinter-prone products of the 19th century gradually disappeared. Consumers became accustomed to increasingly comfortable paper. And once people experienced better products, they rarely wanted to go back. The result was one of the most successful consumer transformations in modern history. An item that barely existed in the mid-1800s became a near-universal household necessity by the mid-1900s. Entire generations grew up unable to imagine life without it. Yet the strangest chapter in the story arrived decades later. Because toilet paper would eventually reveal something unexpected about human behavior. Panic. The first major toilet paper panic occurred in 1973. The event began with a joke. Johnny Carson, host of The Tonight Show, mentioned concerns about a possible toilet paper shortage during a comedy monologue. The audience laughed. Unfortunately, many viewers missed the joke. Within days, Americans across the country began purchasing toilet paper in extraordinary quantities. Store shelves emptied. Customers panicked. News reports amplified the concern, which caused more panic, which emptied more shelves. A product that had been widely available suddenly became difficult to find. Not because factories stopped producing it, not because raw materials disappeared, but because millions of consumers became convinced that everyone else was buying it. The shortage became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It remains one of the most fascinating examples of consumer psychology in modern history. And then it happened again, almost 50 years later. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, as uncertainty spread across the globe, consumers rushed into supermarkets. Many purchased food. Others purchased medicine. But one product became the symbol of the entire phenomenon. Toilet paper. Photos of empty shelves circulated online. People filled garages with enormous stockpiles. Some households accumulated enough toilet paper to last years. Economists studied the behavior. Psychologists analyzed it. The explanations varied. But one conclusion appeared repeatedly. Toilet paper had become psychologically associated with security. When people felt uncertain about the future, they bought products that represented control over daily life. Toilet paper became one of those products. A humble household item had become an emotional comfort object. Millions of Americans once cleaned themselves with corn cobs. Not paper. Not tissues. Not wet wipes. Corn cobs. And strange as that sounds, they were actually one of the better options. For most of human history, toilet paper did not exist. Not in ancient Rome, not in medieval Europe, not during the Renaissance, not even in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Every human being who ever lived faced exactly the same problem. What do you do after using the toilet? The answers were often uncomfortable, sometimes painful, and occasionally dangerous. Yet for thousands of years, people simply accepted these solutions because they had no alternative. The modern role of toilet paper sitting in your bathroom today is one of those inventions so ordinary that nobody thinks about it. But if you remove it from history, the world becomes a very different place. To understand how strange things once were, we need to travel back thousands of years. Long before supermarkets. Long before plumbing. Long before bathrooms even existed. Because for most of human history, people did not go to the bathroom in private. The idea of a private bathroom is surprisingly modern. Ancient cities had public latrines where dozens of people sat side by side doing their business while carrying on conversations. Imagine walking into a room today and finding 20 strangers sitting together in a public restroom discussing politics. That would seem absurd. To the Romans, it was perfectly normal. Ancient Rome possessed some of the most sophisticated sanitation systems in the ancient world. Their aqueducts carried water across enormous distances. Their sewer systems were engineering marvels. Yet even they had no toilet paper. Instead, Romans used something called a tersorium. A tersorium was essentially a sponge attached to a wooden stick. After using the toilet, a person would clean themselves using the sponge and then place it back into a container filled with vinegar or salt water. Then the next person used the same sponge. And then the next. And then the next. The sponge was communal, shared by everyone. The modern human mind immediately recoils from this idea. But remember, toilet paper had not been invented. People used whatever solution was available.